Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Better Call Saul Season 5. In this video, I'll be looking at the entirety of Season 5 of Better Call Saul as a whole. So I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for Better Call Saul Season 5. If you haven't seen up to the end of Season 5, you will not want to watch this video. Otherwise, some things will be spoiled for you. So, I've been making these end of season reviews for Better Call Saul since the show first started, and I find that with almost every review I find myself saying that this is the best season yet, and I realize I'm starting to sound repetitive. Now, with a show like Breaking Bad, I think that actually was the case, where every season was better than the previous one. Season 2 was better than Season 1, Season 3 was better than Season 2, Season 4 was better than Season 3, and until the final season was the best. I'm not quite so sure that that same thing is happening with Better Call Saul. I don't think that necessarily every season is better than the last, as I may think that Season 3 was better than Season 4, and perhaps Season 1 was better than Season 2. But I think the reason why I always find myself saying with each season that this is the best season yet is because the show has a way of reinventing itself every season. And so each season it feels fresh and new, so it may seem like it's the best season because it's managed to present something new with a different focus while keeping the core element that makes the show great. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily Season 5 isn't the best season of the show. It could be. I just don't want to jump to that same claim I've made so flippantly in the past. I'd like to reflect on this a bit more. Now, Better Call Saul remains at its heart a character show, probably even more so than Breaking Bad. It's certainly more of a slow burn than Breaking Bad, which remains true even in Season 5. However, Season 5 has done the most out of any season so far to advance the story, and it does put us very close to catching up with the timeline where Saul Goodman is first introduced into Breaking Bad. Season 5, after all, has been confirmed to be the penultimate season of the show, there being only one season remaining in which presumably will be caught up to the time where Saul was first introduced in Breaking Bad. Therefore, in Season 5, the characters and situations are matching more with how we saw them portrayed in Breaking Bad than they ever had before. But they're still not quite there yet, which makes speculating on how they may get there to be a fascinating endeavor. But since this is a character-based show, let me examine this Season 5 by going through the characters to see how they advanced in this season. And let's start with the main character, Saul Goodman, aka Jimmy McGill. Now, this is the first time, the first season in which he was referred to as Saul Goodman more often than not, after having his name legally changed at the end of Season 4, and now it is his professional name. In fact, the only people still referring to him as Jimmy are the people who knew him from before, such as Kim and Howard. But more than that, his character fits more with Saul Goodman persona that we saw in Breaking Bad than it ever has before in this show. As in Season 1 of Better Call Saul, we're introduced to Jimmy McGill, a reformed con artist who wants to be a legit big-shot lawyer like his brother and prove to his brother his worth. He goes into elder law and uses his skills to help those less capable than himself. Sometimes he falls back to his grifter tendencies, but his heart is in the right place. Move forward to Season 5, where we meet Saul Goodman, a fast-talking defense attorney who offers his services to lowlives and people mostly guilty of the crimes that they commit. And in contrast to Kim, who I'll get to shortly, he mostly enables these lowlives and their criminal behavior, because that doesn't concern him. The only thing that concerns him is being successful, which is mostly measured by how much money he makes. So that becomes the name of the game. When he's offered a job at his deceased brother's firm at a position to which Jimmy McGill very much aspired to back in Season 1, he rejects it outright. He no longer desires his brother's respect or those of his peers, and in fact, after the conflict with his brother, he's now soured to all of those lawyers and high society types like Howard, and looks down on them and doesn't want to join them, but wants to show them that he's times better than them. Now, he's still a bit removed from the Saul Goodman we meet in Breaking Bad, as the character, as we're introduced to in Breaking Bad, has no moral compunctions whatsoever. In one of the very first scenes we see him in, he suggests to Walt and Jesse to have their man who is called shanked in order to solve their problem. And repeatedly throughout the series will suggest to criminals to have people killed, such as he often used the euphemism going to Belize to suggest someone be killed. And on top of that, he willfully becomes the main lawyer in charge of the financial side at the time, which was the most notorious manufacturer of crystal meth in New Mexico. But because he saw it as a way to make a ridiculous amount of money, he was all for it. Now, the Saul Goodman of Season 5 is not up to that bar. While he has no problem enabling criminals to act criminally, he would never directly suggest to have someone killed or actively participate in a large-scale organized crime the way he does in Breaking Bad. So in other words, even though he has less morals than Jimmy McGill did at the start of Better Call Saul, he still has more morals than Saul Goodman did when we first met him in Breaking Bad. Though we start to see the descent this season with Saul becoming more comfortable and enticed by criminal behavior. He's approached by Lalo Salamanca to be a lawyer for one of his men, Crazy 8, who was arrested. And he was brought in by Nacho, whom Saul had dealings with before, as Nacho wanted them to work together to rob a naive couple, but at the time Jimmy McGill was completely against it. And even now, Saul is very resistant to working for people obviously associated with the drug cartels, and he keeps trying to make excuses to back out, but Lalo is very insistent. What he wants Saul to do is to get Crazy 8 to inform to the DEA, which Saul doesn't know at the time, but it's an effort to attack and undermine his adversary Gus Fring. Saul takes the job and does his job really well, which only ingratiates himself to Lalo further. So that when Lalo himself is arrested, something that was orchestrated by Gus Fring in retaliation, he turns to Saul Goodman to help him out. And again, Saul is very resistant. For one, he sees the task of getting Lalo bail an impossible one, and for two, he's still very resistant to the notion of getting involved with the drug cartels. However, Lalo makes him an offer to become a friend of the cartel, a phrase that implies a lot of money and power, and this offer is too enticing for Saul, whose ultimate goal is to win, so he takes the offer. Also, what's interesting to note, that at the start of the season, Kim, who is Jimmy's biggest anchor to his sense of morality and doing the right thing, gave him a briefcase as a gift for regaining his law license. But she was unaware that he was going to change his name, so it had Jimmy's initials on it, JMM. He tells her if anyone asks, he'll just tell them it stands for Justice Matters Most, which does sound a lot like something Season 1 Jimmy would say. But when Lalo later asks what JMM stands for, Saul says, unconvincingly, Justice Matters Most, and Lalo suggests changing his motto to Just Make Money, which does seem more along the lines of Breaking Bad Saul Goodman and is more in line with Saul's goal of winning. So with some help from Mike, who's working with Gus, who wants Lalo out on bail, he pulls off the impossible task of getting Lalo bail. However, at the hearing, it's evident that seeing the family of the man that Lalo killed really bothers Saul's conscience, and you can tell he feels really guilty about this and perhaps even has second thoughts about doing it. But he does it anyway and still does a great job at it. But as I noted before, Saul Goodman of Breaking Bad would have not felt guilty, and he would have had no compunction whatsoever of getting a guilty man on bail. But Jimmy McGill of Season 1 of Better Call Saul would have never went through with it, but Season 5 Saul did, meaning he's closer to becoming Breaking Bad Saul Goodman, but not quite there yet. In addition, when Lalo asks him to retrieve the $7 million he needs to post bail, Saul is really resistant to doing this, so something that's so blatantly illegal and dangerous, but his new desire to win, to make money at all costs, gets the better of him, and when he's offered a large sum. So Lalo agrees, and Saul goes to do it over Kim's objections as he tries to assure her it's completely safe. But that turns out not to be the case, and Saul's ambushed by a cartel gang which is part of the internal struggle between Lalo and Gus. They were hired to ensure that Lalo didn't post bail, and so Saul was going to be killed for involving himself in this struggle, but thankfully Gus's interest was for Lalo to post bail, and so he sent his man Mike there to save Saul, and after a long, arduous walk through the desert, they were able to get home safely. But the incident scarred Saul for life, who will forever be haunted by this traumatic experience that he had, where he almost was killed and had to fight for his survival. But from Breaking Bad, we do know that the takeaway he got from this experience wasn't that the criminal life was too dangerous and had to be avoided at all costs, because we see that he will continually put himself back at risk in order to accomplish the goal of winning. That making money and being successful at all costs will be his main takeaway. However, we're not sure how it will arrive there, and this most likely has something to do with his relationship with Kim. Now, Jimmy and Kim's relationship has always been at the heart of the show, but that's even more true in Season 5, and there's some symbiotic nature of their relationship takes turns that you may not have expected. In fact, I may even go as far to say that Season 5 was really Kim's season. Now, we also knew that Kim is what kept Jimmy grounded. Whenever he was at risk of going too far, Kim was there to hold him back. Kim always encouraged him to stay more on the straight and narrow. She supported him when he went into elder law and was there to take him back, talk him back into becoming a lawyer when he was thinking about quitting. There is a huge difference between her and Chuck, though, and that is that Kim believes in him and thought that he was capable of becoming a great lawyer, and she even took his side against Chuck and helped him to fight Chuck when he tried to have take his law license away from him. But Jimmy knew that she didn't at all approve of his less than legal and morally ambiguous activities, which is why he sometimes hid them from her and sometimes refused to even do them because he knew that she would improve. So many have made the assumption that since we don't see Kim in Breaking Bad, that it's exactly her absence that has caused him to turn into a full-on criminal, money-grabbing, sleazy lawyer that he is. However, this season makes us doubt that assumption. Now, Kim and Jimmy's relationship has always been complex. While it's true that Kim was good at keeping him grounded, keeping him honest, he also had an effect on her, as we've seen for a while now that she always got a kick out of running scams with him, and over the years those scams grew in scope and size. In fact, more recently when their relationship turned more romantic, we see that Kim grows closer to Jimmy whenever they pull off scams together, which really excites her and makes her more passionate towards him. Season 4 and Season 5 has shown a trend of a very toxic, dysfunctional relationship between Kim and Jimmy. And so much when they are both living normal lives, their relationship grows cold and the two of them become really distant with each other. It's only when they're up to no good, or at least one of them is, in trouble, that their relationship is at its height and most passionate. And that's where the season began, with Kim and Jimmy being distant and cold and barely acknowledging each other. Kim runs into Saul while dealing with a stubborn client who insists on going to trial, when doing so would surely land him 5 years in prison, where Kim managed to get him a great deal where he only does 6 months, but he refuses to listen to reason. So Saul comes up with an idea to run a scam on him, pretending to be the DA refusing to take the deal in order to scare him into taking the deal. But Kim outright refuses and in fact gets very angry with Jimmy for even suggesting it. But the moment she returns to her client, she runs the scan anyway by herself and then scares her client into taking the deal. Now, this was a vital step in Kim's journey, as it taught her that she could accomplish more good by playing dirty, by doing things the Saul Goodman way rather than playing it safe. However, initially she felt very guilty over doing this and made Jimmy promise never to suggest anything like this again, and she went back to her normal playing it safe job. That is until she was asked by her Mercer Verde clients to evict an old man who refused to leave his home so her clients could build a call center. At first, she yelled at the man and tried to shame him, who called her a snake in a suit, but then she realized that she felt that he was right and that she hated the people she worked for and what they were doing. So she went to Kevin at Mercer Verde and tried to convince him to back off, but he stubbornly refused. And the more she pushed, the more adamant he was that he wasn't going to let an old man push him around. And so she then turned to Saul Goodman to run a scheme. And Saul, of course, was all in on this scheme that eventually turned very personal and dirty against Kevin. So Kim had second thoughts and decided to back out. After coming up with the idea for the scam, before it was time to run it, she realized she didn't want to do it. But of course, there was absolutely no way that Saul was going to let this go. So he went ahead with the plan anyway, even though Kim said not to. This, of course, made her furious, as she thought that she couldn't trust Saul anymore, so she was considering leaving him, which Saul absolutely didn't want. So he went with the second option, and that is to marry each other. They rationalized this as a legal decision so that Kim couldn't be compelled to testify against him, and that therefore Saul could be completely honest with her from now on. But whether they admit it or not, it did change the way that they thought of each other, and it strengthened their relationship. But part of their agreement was that Saul could be completely truthful to her no matter what. A deal he mostly upholds, but he does hold back a little bit on the finer details. And so it appears that Kim is the anchor that is keeping Saul grounded, but at the same time we see the effect he's had on her, as she learned that running scams and doing things the Saul Goodman way gets things accomplished, and although she feels guilty over doing things like lying to her clients, she's trying to help. And Kevin at Mercer Verde pays her bills. Deep inside, something about it is very exciting and enticing to her, and she tries to hold back that part of her, but doesn't always manage it. For example, if she really wanted out of the doing shady, illegal, and less than moral schemes, she could have just left Jimmy, but instead she decided to get married, which even deepens her connection to it. She tried to lie to herself that she was going to keep Jimmy honest, but I think part of her knew that that wasn't going to be the case, and that she embraced that part of herself. And a huge change happened in Kim when Jimmy almost died by being a bagman for the cartels. That near-death experience made her realize how fragile life is, and she no longer wanted to live her life doing something that doesn't make her happy. So she quits her job, gives up Mercer Verde so that she can focus on her pro bono clients, because that's what makes her happy. That's what she thinks makes life worth living. Jimmy, however, is not okay with this, Kim is upset because she supported him in his life decision to become Saul Goodman and a criminal lawyer, but Jimmy doesn't see it as the same thing, as he thought his decision was to make more money, to become more successful, to become a winner, whereas Kim is walking away from money. She's turning away from success, and Saul sees this as welcoming failure. However, their argument is cut short by Lalo entering their home and threatening them, as he can sense that Saul is lying about what happened in the desert. But eventually Kim is the one who gets rid of him by yelling at him, telling him that Saul isn't lying and that he needs to get his own house in order, because he obviously can't trust his own men if he has Saul picking up his drug money. This seems to convince him, and he leaves. So this experience has different effects on Saul and Kim. For Saul, he becomes even more terrified and fearful, mainly fearful for Kim's well-being, because he feels really guilty about ever getting her involved in this. He bugs the shit out of Mike in order to get some reassurance, and eventually Mike tells him that Lalo will be dead after tonight, so he won't have to worry about him anymore, which does put him at ease. However, this has a very different effect on Kim, who gets even more gung-ho on her pro bono cases. In fact, she goes out of her way to ask for more and harder cases. The thought of her life being in danger just makes her want to live her life even more, and she feels most alive when doing these pro bono cases. But that's when Howard enters the picture, as he runs into Kim at the courthouse and is dismayed to learn that Kim has quit Mercer Verde. So he sets her aside, tells her what Jimmy did to him, how Jimmy threw bowling balls at his car to destroy it, and how he sent prostitutes to his business lunches to embarrass him. All just because he offered Jimmy a job at HHM. He suspects that it's Jimmy's fault that Kim quit her job, and he cautions her to stay away from Jimmy, saying that he is unhinged. This just pisses Kim off, as she's still resentful toward Howard for the way he neglected her, and just being associated with Jimmy, and of course for the way that he treated Jimmy. So she just laughed at him and tells him that he doesn't even know Jimmy. Howard retorts by saying the person who did know Jimmy was Chuck, and then he leaves. This obviously angers Kim to no end, as Chuck was resentful and jealous of Jimmy, and of course Chuck pushed the narrative that Jimmy had no business being a lawyer, so this infuriates her to a very large degree. So much so that when she's having dinner later that night, she tells Jimmy about about what Howard said throwing the bowling balls and sending prostitutes to his lunches. And at first Jimmy is very cautious, as he thinks Kim might chastise him for what he did, but instead Kim just asks what they should do to Howard next. And the two of them stay up all night talking about ways to get back at Howard, until Kim finally comes up with the idea to do something so big to disgrace him and his reputation that the other lawyers involved in the Sandpiper case would feel compelled to settle, meaning Jimmy would get his big $2 million settlement. Jimmy thinks they're just joking around at first, until Kim reveals she's being serious. Jimmy tries to convince her that this isn't her and that she wouldn't be okay with this in the cold light of day, but Kim disagrees and is in fact very jocular about it. So a lot of people are calling this Kim's Breaking Bad moment, and in the way it is. However, there are some key differences between where her character is at and where Jimmy/Saul is at. As Kim's ultimate goal is to use the Sandpiper money to open her own pro bono practice, where she can offer those who normally couldn't afford lawyers the same representation that is typically only reserved for those who are very wealthy, which is in fact a very noble and honorable goal. However, she's willing to ruin a man's life in order to do it in a way that would be highly illegal, but the man she wants to ruin is the one she sees She views this man as unfairly privileged and arrogant, and one whom she has had a personal grudge against for various reasons. One could almost classify this as a Robin Hood complex, where she plans to steal from the rich to give to the poor, kind of. Whereas Saul's intentions are similar, but a bit different, as Saul also wants to get back at Howard, but by showing him how much better than him he is by becoming more successful. And yes, this would be less cruel than Kim, who essentially wants to ruin his career, but Saul's reasoning is entirely selfish. He doesn't want to help other people in the way Kim does. In fact, he's willing to use people, overcharge them, or to defend murderers and drug dealers and put them back on the streets where they can harm others again, as long as it profits him. So yes, Kim has broken bad, but in a very different way than Jimmy. I disagree with the sentiment that Kim is actually worse, as I would say Saul is actually worse, as Kim's goals are still noble and she wants to help people and doesn't care if someone undeserving and despicable like Howard has to be pulled under in order to do it. Whereas Saul doesn't give a crap about who he hurts and isn't really interested in helping anyone but himself. He just wants to prove that he's a winner. It's just that in this instant, Kim is willing to go further in terms of doing something illegal and immoral than Saul is, as this version of Saul Goodman is not quite to the level that Saul Goodman of Breaking Bad is. In fact, the reason is mainly because of Kim. So it does in fact throw Saul's worldview into chaos when his anchor into good has suddenly turned into the devil on his shoulder, urging him to do bad. It's a very interesting and complex give and take relationship that Kim and Saul have, as Kim's presence is what makes Saul want to do the right thing and is what's giving him his conscience, but the effect Saul has on Kim is almost the opposite, where it feeds her thrill of the game and her willingness to forego the rules and act in ways many would deem immoral in order to get the job done. But it now appears that Kim has gone so far into the area of not caring about what's moral that she's now going to have a negative effect on Saul and take him down even further. And so now I'll get more into speculation mode on what may come next. And I shall I say that perhaps Kim's turn for the worse will play a part in why Saul becomes the Saul of Breaking Bad, with no conscience, no moral compunction whatsoever, who's willing to get very actively involved in the drug trade and criminal activities. So I would guess that Kim and Saul go through with their plan on Howard, and it works actually even better than they wanted, and or at least more dire consequences for Howard, completely ruining Howard, and perhaps Howard even loses his life. And this guilt becomes way too much for Kim, who can't live with herself for what she did and her part of it. So she leaves Saul because she realizes the negative effect that he's had on her. While meanwhile, Saul profits off it greatly and sees it as a really good thing. This combined with the scheme that Saul goes in with on Nacho in order to get rid of Lalo that works, makes Saul more convinced that going into this full criminal mode, because he profits off it greatly, and it's his road into becoming a winner, a very successful man, which is his ultimate goal. And being abandoned by Kim is what drives him into full apathy and not giving a crap about anyone anymore, and sort of let go of that part. Just still has a bit of a conscience. But that is just my guess. We'll have to wait for next season to see. So other than Saul and Kim, this season also touched on other characters such as Mike, Gus, Nacho, and Lalo. Now, Mike's storyline is probably the one I would personally point to as the weakest aspect of the season, as I wasn't completely sold on it. Mike starts the season feeling really down on himself over having to kill a friend whom he considered to be a good man, and shortly thereafter he goes on a self-destructive downward spiral. He refuses to work for Gus anymore, even after Gus offers to give him money as a retainer. He then becomes a drunk who is cruel to his granddaughter and eventually picks a fight with a street gang who nearly kills him. However, when he wakes up, he finds that Gus had brought him to Mexico to recover under his doctor's care. And after a little while spent there healing, where he makes friends with his nurse, Gus finally visits him and implores him to work for him, as Gus is in a war and he needs soldiers. Now, it does make a lot of sense to me that Gus would recognize and appreciate Mike's value, as Gus is not prideful, he's nor arrogant, and is more of a straightforward businessman who has the ability to recognize and a potential asset. However, I don't quite buy it from Mike's side. Now, Gus does tell Mike that if he continues on his current path, there's only one outcome, meaning death, and Mike does understand this, which could be a good argument that Mike needs to turn his life around. However, I'm not completely convinced that it's enough for Mike to want to work for Gus, as Mike was so disgusted with Gus for making him kill the German construction worker. And in fact, Mike posits why work for a drug dealer who's killing other drug dealers? Why is that the right thing for him? And Gus's only answer is that he understands revenge. Now, this does harken back to Mike's backstory on how Mike killed the two cops that killed his son, and perhaps Gus knew about this, which is why he mentioned it. But I am not sure why that would convince Mike, just knowing that Gus's motivation is revenge. It doesn't change the fact that he's still working for a drug dealer who wants to kill other drug dealers. I thought this might be a good start. Maybe eventually he comes around to Gus's way of thinking, but in the very next episode, we see Mike fully devoted to working for Gus, and he even takes on more responsibility. And the rest of the season, he seems fully devoted to Gus, and I think that happened way too fast, particularly the way they presented him at the start of the season as being suicidal, as he was so resentful to Gus for making him kill a good man, to all of a sudden just being completely devoted to Gus just for mentioning revenge. Doesn't seem like enough to me. Now, granted, Mike does explain to his daughter-in-law that he made a choice to move on with his life, but that doesn't quite cover it for me. But even though Mike is all in on working for Gus now, he's still a bit removed from where we see him in Breaking Bad, as he hasn't completely lost his moral compass yet, as he still seems to be a bit hesitant to kill and continues to argue for leniency for Nacho, so something still needs to happen to Mike to make him even more callous before we catch up with him in Breaking Bad times. But he's almost there. Another major character this season is Lalo Salamanca, introduced at the end of the previous season. Lalo very quickly became a very interesting and important character. His ability to be likable and friendly even while being threatening and deadly is absolutely impressive, and the actor who portrays him did an amazing job. So Lalo had a feud with Fring and discovered part of what he was up to with the construction of the underground meth lab, but not the whole thing. So Gus talks to him and the cartel representative Juan Bolsa and feeds them a story that explains the construction as a legitimate freezer for his restaurant business. This appeases Bolsa, who insists that this settles the matter between Gus and Lalo, but Lalo isn't so convinced. He becomes obsessed with sabotaging Gus and ruining him until he no longer is financially viable for the cartel, meaning he would lose his protection. He starts by taking advantage of one of his men getting arrested to feed false information, or actually valid information, to the DEA to get Gus's men arrested. Gus retaliates by having Lalo arrested for the murder that he committed at the end of season 4, but Lalo continues to disrupt his businesses even from jail by having Nacho burn down his main Los Pollos Hermanos restaurant. So Gus then decides the best thing to do is to help Lalo get bail so that he must flee to Mexico and will be out of his hair. But Juan Bolsa is not aware of this, and he has his own plans to stop Lalo from disrupting Gus's businesses, and that is hiring gunmen to ensure that Lalo doesn't get bail. However, luckily Mike was watching over the money exchange, so he was there to save Saul from the gunmen and make sure the bail went forward. However, once Lalo discovered Saul's car was shot up and in a ditch, it was very inconsistent with his story of simply breaking down, and he got suspicious and decided to drive down to Mexico himself with Nacho. Now, I'm still not sure on whether or not he would have died had he gone with the men sent to escort him to Mexico. Perhaps they were sent by Juan Bolsa. I'm not sure. And I'm also unclear on whether or not Lalo knows that Bolsa is actively working against him, though I highly suspect that he does. As once Lalo is in Mexico, he goes above Bolsa's head to Don Alardio to suck up to Alardio really hard by buying him a super expensive car and giving him tons of money. However, Gus, possibly with the help of Juan Bolsa, I'm still unclear on that, but he arranges to have Lalo killed while he's in Mexico. However, the attempt fails as Lalo was able to get away from him using a relative as a human shield and then killing all of the men who were sent to kill him. So now Lalo's going to really be out for blood for Gus and quite possibly Bolsa as well. So it's going to make the coming confrontation really exciting. However, another important character this season whose storyline I loved was Nacho, as Nacho has become a character you can really sympathize with. In fact, in many ways he reminds me a lot of Jesse from Breaking Bad, as Nacho is a good person at heart who doesn't really belong in a life of crime, who is nonetheless stuck in that life and can't get out of it. In fact, I found the scene that shows Nacho at his home with the hot women hanging around him who are obviously addicted to drugs, and how unhappy he was in that life reminded me a lot of the scene where Jesse was having house parties and living the high life and yet was still very unhappy. So we know that Gus has him working for him as a spy on the Salamancas, and when Nacho failed to deliver valuable information, Gus threatened to have his father killed. To prevent that, Nacho tried to have his father move away by getting someone to buy his business at a much higher value than what it's worth, but his father saw through this and knew he was behind it and so refused to take his drug money. He still insists that Nacho go to the police, not understanding that if Nacho did that, they'd both be killed. So Nacho is stuck in an impossible situation. So he tries his best to give Gus what he wants, and he does that by risking his own life in order to ingratiate himself to Lalo. Meanwhile, he keeps trying to convince his new handler, Mike, to convince Gus to let him go. And although Mike is a hard ass to Nacho, he does try to stick up for him with Gus. But Nacho is too valuable of an asset for Gus to give up. This all comes to a head, however, when Nacho takes an active role in the assassination attempt on Lalo in Mexico, as Nacho lets the assassins into the estate and tells them where to find Gus. And it's evident that Lalo, who survived that attempt, is aware of the role that Nacho played in the attempt on his life. So what will Lalo do next? Will he play along with Nacho knowing full well that he's working with Gus Fring in order to feed Gus false information? Or will he simply be out for blood for Nacho as he knows he betrayed him? And what will this mean for Nacho going forward? Will he ever be able to escape this cartel life? Will his father be able to escape the danger he's in? Or is the fate waiting for them much darker? It's exciting, and I absolutely can't wait to find out. So my rating for Better Call Saul Season 5 out of 10 is a 9 excellent. A really powerful season that really pushes the characters closer to what we know of them from Breaking Bad, while having some pretty exciting twists and turns. And the slow-paced character stories may have been at its best as we see Kim and Jimmy's off and on relationship that's stronger when they're scheming together take hold on both of them, and how Saul's near-death experience has profound effects on both of them. On top of that, the dispute between Gus and the Salamancas got much more exciting with the new element of Lalo, who is a very charismatic and interesting character who adds a lot to the show. And it does more to drag Saul into the criminal side of the story, bringing together the two storylines that through most of the show were pretty separate. Brings them back together, which makes things really exciting as these two worlds collide. So that's it for my review of Better Call Saul Season 5. I will return to cover Season 6 whenever Season 6 returns, which hopefully won't be too long away. But in the meantime, you can check out my channel as I cover many other shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.